I'd spent years waiting for the perfect moment to prove them wrong. This pristine envelope arriving on my desk was it. The envelope was ivory thick enough to feel expensive, embossed with gold lettering that shimmered in the morning light. It smelled faintly of roses and wealth, Ethan's kind of scent. Inside the words were simple: Ethan and Sophie invite you to celebrate their wedding at the Whitman estate. For a moment, I just stared at it, the edges digging into my fingers. My brother was finally getting everything he ever wanted: money, status, applause. And he'd made sure to remind me, the sister who once sewed her own prom dress from thrift store curtains, exactly where I stood. He had no idea that the sister he dismissed as a failed seamstress now signed checks thicker than this estate's annual budget. The contrast was a sharp, bitter pleasure, a reminder of the quiet empire I'd built while he sought his public validation. The last time Ethan had spoken to me was Thanksgiving 2 years ago. He'd shown up in his tailored Navy suit, talking about stock shares and Dad's new business partners, while I was still recovering from a factory fire that had wiped out the small studio I'd built from nothing. He hadn't asked if I was okay. He'd just smiled that glossy, perfect smile and said, "You should really think about getting a real job, Lena. Designing isn't a career, it's a hobby." Now, 2 years later, I was holding a wedding invitation engraved on paper thicker than my rent agreement. The irony almost made me laugh. I turned the card over, expecting a handwritten note, anything that acknowledged the sister he hadn't spoken to. But there was only a printed RSVP link. Typical Ethan. Digital affection for digital people. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the kind that came from a tin instead of a boutique roaster, and stared out the window of my downtown apartment. The skyline shimmered with late morning sunglass and ambition stretching endlessly upward. I'd built something of my own since that fire, quietly, anonymously, but no one in my family knew. That was part of the plan. "Still thinking about going?" Marcus asked, leaning against the doorway. He was my assistant, or rather, my business partner, though he preferred the background. Sharp British and perpetually calm, Marcus handled the things I didn't want the public to see. "Of course I'm going," I said, setting the invitation on the counter. "Family events are educational." He smirked. "Educational or strategic? Both." He nodded slowly. "The press will be there. Whitman weddings are practically state events. You know they'll recognize you." "I doubt it," I said, turning back to my laptop. "The last time they saw me, I was broke and invisible. I've learned to make invisibility a skill." Marcus folded his arms. "Invisible people don't own 70% of a global fashion house." "Shh," I said, pressing a finger to my lips. "That's our little secret. For now." I opened my inbox, where the subject lines glowed with power: shareholder meeting agenda. Stock split projections. Lux Collective acquisition offer. All under my corporate alias, L. Vale, CEO of V. Monroe Holdings. No one connected Lena Vale, the plain girl from Long Island, to the billionaire designer whose empire quietly dominated 3 continents. Not even my family, especially not my brother. The wedding would be televised. Sophie Whitman, the bride, came from a dynasty of old money and glossy magazine covers. Their marriage was less romance, more merger. I knew her face from the news, delicate, polished, perfectly edited. The kind of woman Ethan had always said I should learn from. I still remembered our last fight. "You walk around like some tragic artist," he'd said, sipping Dad's expensive scotch. "But the truth is, you just don't know how to win." I'd smiled then, small, deliberate. "Maybe you're right," I'd said. "But I know how to wait." And I had waited. Through the fire that nearly ruined me. Through the sleepless nights, sketching designs by candlelight because I couldn't afford the power bill. Through the investors who laughed at me until I stopped asking for permission and bought their companies instead. The wedding invitation still lay on the counter, catching the light. Marcus picked it up, read the name again. "Whitman Estate, Greenwich. You know that'll be crawling with cameras, right?" "That's the point," I said softly. "He always wanted an audience." He raised an eyebrow. "And what do you want?" I took the invitation from his hand, slipped it into my purse, and smiled. "Just closure." But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't closure. It was the beginning. That night, as the city lights flickered below my window, I opened my private file, the one labeled Operation Exposure. Inside was everything I'd need: contracts, transfer records, proof of theft of my designs, my inheritance, my name. I traced my finger over the folder's edge, the same way I used to trace fabric seams as a child. Justice like fashion was all about timing, and at my brother's wedding, timing would be everything. The Whitman estate looked like something out of a royal documentary. White stone columns, chandeliers, visible even from the driveway, and a garden so perfectly trimmed it felt like it was painted. The kind of place that didn't smell like flowers, but like power perfume and money too old to fade. I parked 2 blocks away. The valet looked at my car, an unremarkable black sedan, and barely hid his disapproval. I almost laughed. If he knew who owned the dealership chain that imported his favorite luxury cars, he might have bowed instead. But that was the beauty of anonymity. It made the reveal that much sweeter. Miss Vale. The wedding planner. A thin woman with a clipboard and the tension of someone paid to please billionaires, squinted at me. Family of the groom, I said with a smile. Lena Navarro. Her posture softened immediately. Ah, of course. Ethan's sister. Right this way. The marble floors echoed under my heels as she guided me through the foyer. Everywhere I looked, wealth gleamed: caviar trays, designer gowns, champagne flutes that probably cost more than my first apartment. And then I saw them, my parents. Mom looked radiant in navy silk pearls around her neck. She'd aged gracefully, the kind of woman who'd never been poor a day in her life, not because she was rich, but because she refused to acknowledge poverty. Dad stood beside her, thinner, now his gray suit tailored but tired. Lena, Mom said, her voice warm but cautious. You came. I did. I kissed her cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and expensive lotion. Dad gave a stiff nod. Didn't expect you to show up, kiddo. Thought you'd be too busy with whatever it is you do now. I make things, I said simply. Still do, he chuckled. Ah, always the dreamer. Well, maybe seeing your brother today will inspire you to what, I asked, smiling politely. Marry rich. Mom's expression faltered. Lena, it's fine, I said, turning toward the courtyard where laughter spilled from the open doors. I wouldn't want to ruin the mood. Through the glass, I saw Ethan. Tall, broad-shouldered, perfect hair, as always, surrounded by people hanging on every word he said. He wore confidence like armor, his smile sharp enough to cut. Beside him stood Sophie, the bride-to-be, graceful, glowing, and utterly at ease in her designer gown. I stayed near the edge of the crowd, content to watch. My brother thrived on attention. I thrived in its absence. Still keeping to yourself, a familiar voice teased. I turned to see Robert Whitman, Sophie's father. Older now, but his handshake was still iron. He'd once rejected my business proposal without reading it. The world doesn't need another fashion brand, he'd said then, especially from someone so inexperienced. Mr. Whitman? I said pleasantly. You haven't changed. Neither have you, he said, sipping his drink. Still modest. That's rare in this crowd. Oh, I learned modesty pays better when you own the shares, I replied lightly. He didn't catch it, of course. Before he could ask what I meant, the music shifted, the sound of a string quartet easing into a classic waltz. Ethan tapped his glass, calling for attention. Everyone, he announced. Before dinner, I want to thank my family, especially my sister Lena. She came all the way from wherever she's living now. Laughter rippled through the guests. I held my smile. Ethan continued, grinning wide. Lena's always been, let's say, budget conscious. She once gave me a tie she sewed herself, made from a thrift store curtain. A real passion project, wasn't it? Lena still cheap as ever. More laughter. Sophie giggled politely, touching his arm. At least you're consistent, he finished, smirking. A few people chuckled. Others looked away, uncomfortable. I held my champagne glass, the bubbles rising slowly, steady. Consistency's underrated, I said. It's how empires are built. He blinked, unsure if it was a joke. Right. Anyway. But before he could finish, Sophie glanced toward the bar where a television hung discreetly on the wall. The muted screen displayed the morning market segment from CNBC. And there it was. My company's logo. Lena V. The billionaire behind America's most powerful fashion empire. The reporter's voice carried faintly. With her latest acquisition, CEO Lena Vale has tripled her company's valuation to over $3 billion. The crowd went silent. Even the violins faltered. Sophie's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble. "Ethan," she whispered, "isn't that your sister?" Ethan turned toward the screen. His face was drained of color. And for the first time in years, my brother, my arrogant, perfect, cruel brother, had nothing to say. I sipped my champagne, the gold bubbles catching the light like victory. "Consistency," I murmured, "pays off after all." The music tried to resume, but it couldn't. Not when the truth had already taken center stage. That was the night the Navarro family learned what silence could build, and how loud it could become when it finally spoke. The city never really slept, but that night it felt quieter, like the whole world had paused to whisper my name. By midnight, my phone had exploded. Missed calls, messages, journalists, PR agents, even my old college roommate asked if I really owned half of V. Monroe Holdings. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat by the window barefoot, a cup of tea in my hands, and watched the lights flicker below like tiny trembling secrets. I should have felt triumphant. I should have been laughing, but instead I felt hollow. Revenge was supposed to taste sweet. I'd waited years for that moment, Ethan's stunned face, Sophie's gasp, the silence that followed. It was perfect. And yet as the headlines flooded my feed, "Billionaire designer exposes brothers mockery live at wedding," I realized perfection didn't fill the space it left behind. The hollowness wasn't about loneliness. It was the chilling confirmation that the long battle had consumed the sweetness of the victory itself. I had sought justice for myself, but more importantly for Vivian. By midnight, restoring the Monroe name felt less like revenge and more like stabilizing a piece of history that had been brutally knocked off its axis. That realization that I was a caretaker, not just an avenger, was the only thing that settled the strange, empty feeling in my chest. Marcus knocked softly on the open door. "Still awake, barely," I said, setting the cup down. "They won't stop calling. They won't for a while." He leaned against the doorway, calm as ever. "You made history tonight. I didn't mean to make a scene." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You hijacked the most high-profile wedding of the year and turned it into a public reckoning. Don't downplay your genius." I smiled faintly. "I didn't do it for the press." "I know," he said. "But the press is doing it for you. Every outlet's running your story. They're calling you the silent heir, the self-made sister, the woman who played the long game." "Do they know about Grandma?" "Not yet," Marcus said softly. "But they will. Her name's back in the company registry. You restored it tonight." That made me pause. For years, my grandmother, Vivian Navarro, had been erased, written out of the fashion house she built from scratch, replaced by men who wore her work like trophies. She'd taught me that creation was power, but discretion was survival. "You can't win by shouting," she'd said once, tracing a pattern in chalk across a bolt of silk. "You win by letting them forget you're in the room until it's too late." I'd followed her rule my whole life. Tonight was the exception. Marcus checked his phone. "Your parents are trending, by the way. Someone caught your father yelling at Ethan in the parking lot." "Good." I picked up my tea again. "He should yell." He raised him. "And your mother? She'll pretend it never happened. She always does." He hesitated. "Do you regret it?" I looked out the window again. The reflection showed a woman I barely recognized, hair-pinned neatly, eyes sharp, posture steady. Not the girl Ethan mocked at Thanksgiving. Not the one who used to cry over unpaid bills. "No," I said finally. "I regret waiting so long." The next morning came too quickly. I hadn't slept. When I stepped into my office, the entire staff stood. Dozens of people, designers, managers, assistants, looking at me like I'd stepped out of the news and into their reality. "Good morning," I said, setting my bag down. A young intern blurted out, "Ma'am, is it true? You're the Navarro from the Whitman wedding." I met her gaze. I'm the Navarro they tried to erase. Applause broke out soft at first, then building. I wasn't used to it. Praise had never been the goal. Control was. Enough, I said with a smile. We have work to do. Marcus followed me into the conference room where the walls were lined with mood boards for next season's collection, structured silhouettes, clean lines, muted tones. We're ahead of schedule, he said. But after last night, every retailer in the country wants exclusivity. Your stock jumped 30% overnight. I leaned back in my chair. And Ethan, he's been fired from Whitman Textiles. Sophie's father issued a statement calling the marriage indefinitely postponed. I laughed quietly. Postponed. That's rich. For the first time in months, I let myself exhale. The empire my grandmother built, stolen by men, forgotten by history, was whole again. But beneath the satisfaction, something else stirred. Guilt, maybe. Or loneliness. Success could fill a room, but never replace a heartbeat. Marcus interrupted my thoughts. There's one more thing. He slid a folder across the table. Ethan's lawyer sent an inquiry this morning. He's claiming partial ownership of your grandmother's estate. Apparently, he believes the shares were transferred illegally. My pulse didn't quicken. I'd expected this. He can try, I said. But he won't win. He's already hired Whitman's legal team. I smiled. Then I'll handle it the way Grandma taught me, quietly, efficiently, and decisively. Marcus grinned. I'll alert the board. As he left, I turned toward the window again, watching the city hum beneath me. Power, like fashion, had a season. Mine had just begun. Mom called 3 times before I finally picked up. Her voice was calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that comes before a storm. Lena, we need to talk, she said. Your father and I want you to come home. Tonight. Home, I repeated. That's funny. I thought Ethan inherited the house when Dad signed over the deed. Her pause was brief, sharp. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. It's just dinner, Mom, I said flatly. Not Judgment Day. But we both knew it was exactly that. By the time I arrived at the old Navarro house, night had fallen. The lights were on, every window glowing like an accusation. I hadn't been here in nearly 4 years, not since Grandma's funeral. The same silver SUV sat in the driveway. The same hydrangeas lined the walkway. But the house itself felt smaller, almost shrunken under the weight of its own silence. Dad opened the door before I could knock. You're late, he said. I came, I replied. That's more than Ethan did for Grandma's memorial. Inside, the air was heavy with something between perfume and resentment. Mom sat at the dining table, hands folded, her expression polished to perfection. The china was set the same pattern we'd used for Thanksgiving dinners. Except tonight, there were only 3 plates. Ethan's place was empty. I took a seat without waiting to be asked. So I said family dinner, just like old times. Mom's lips tightened. We saw the news, Lena. I assumed you would. You humiliated your brother, Dad snapped. You humiliated this family. I tilted my head. He did that himself. I just let people see it. Mom's voice softened, but her eyes stayed cold. We didn't raise you to air family business in public. No, I said, meeting her gaze. You raised me to stay quiet when people stole from me. When Ethan erased my work and took Grandma's legacy, you demanded silence. When Dad signed the company shares over to him blindly, you insisted I be grateful he kept it in the family. Dad's chair scraped against the floor. Watch your tone. I did, I said evenly. For years. Silence stretched across the table. The old grandfather clock ticked behind us, its rhythm like a countdown. Mom finally exhaled. Your brother is ruined, Lena. His engagement is broken, his reputation destroyed. If you have any decency left, you'll make a statement. Tell the press it was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, I repeated. He mocked me at his wedding. He mocked Grandma's legacy. He called me cheap while living off her money. You want me to fix that with a soundbite? Dad's fist hit the table. He's your brother. I leaned forward, my voice low. He stopped being my brother when he forged Grandma's signature. Mom flinched. You don't know what you're talking about. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Marcus had prepared. Actually, I do. Deed transfers, falsified contracts, fake board approvals, all signed by Ethan, all notarized under your name, Dad. Dad's face was drained of color. Where did you get that? From Grandma's lawyer, the one you fired and replaced with your golf buddy. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of truth filled the room like smoke. Finally, Mom spoke. What are you going to do with this? Nothing, I said, sliding the papers back into the folder. Unless Ethan tries to take me to court. Then it becomes evidence. Dad sank back into his chair. You think this makes you better than us? No, I said quietly. It makes me free. The words hung there, final and irreversible. I stood and walked to the window. Outside the backyard was exactly as I remembered: overgrown grass, the old oak tree still standing tall. Grandma used to sit there every evening sketching with a glass of sherry beside her. She'd told me once, every generation either builds or burns. You just have to decide which one you are. I turned back to my parents. I'm done cleaning up the ashes. Mom's voice trembled for the first time. You've changed. I smiled faintly. No, Mom. I just stopped pretending. When I left, the air outside was crisp, almost cleansing. I paused by the oak tree, touched the rough bark, and whispered, It's done, Grandma. I finally said it. My phone buzzed Marcus again. Ethan's lawyers backed off. His message read, Whitman pulled their support. The stocks are collapsing. I typed back one word, good. Then I looked up at the dark sky, the stars faint but steady. For the first time in years, I felt exactly the same distant quiet and untouchably alive. The next morning, sunlight broke through the Manhattan skyline, sharp and golden, cutting across the glass walls of my office. I hadn't slept. The folder from last night still sat on my desk, edges curling from where my fingers had pressed too hard. Marcus entered without knocking. I figured you'd be here. I don't remember leaving, I said, eyes still fixed on the city below. He placed a coffee on the desk. I called Howard Nathanson, your grandmother's old attorney. He said there's something you should see. Something he couldn't legally release until now. I turned to him slowly. What kind of something? He met my eyes. Letters. Written by Vivian Monroe herself. Addressed to you. By noon, I was sitting in Howard's office, a quiet space filled with old wood and older secrets. His office felt like a library dedicated to discretion. The leather chairs were worn, and the only sound was the soft hum of the city outside. The lockbox he opened was small, black, and utterly unremarkable, containing the most valuable thing. I owned a bundle tied with faded silk ribbon. Your grandmother left these for you, Lena. She asked that I deliver them when she believed you'd be ready, he said. I traced the edges, feeling the texture of the paper. She really thought that far ahead. She always did, he said. Vivian didn't believe in coincidence, only timing. The first envelope was dated 10 years ago. I unfolded the page carefully. Her handwriting, strong, slanted, confident, filled the paper. My dearest Lena, if you're reading this, it means you've already been hurt by someone you love. Don't be ashamed of it. Betrayal is a forge. It burns, yes, but it also shapes. Remember, this power is quiet until it isn't. Let them think you're small. Let them underestimate you. And when you rise, do it without warning. The words were a blueprint. I hadn't realized I was following, a chilling confirmation that she had anticipated every single move my family had made. I read the words twice. My throat tightened. Marcus stood silently behind me, giving me space to breathe. There were 5 letters in total, each one older, more deliberate. One spoke of her battles, how male board members had stolen her designs and presented them as their own. Another detailed the structure of the hidden shares she'd placed under a pseudonym, shares that now made up the backbone of my empire. But the last letter, the one dated only a week before her death, was different. Shorter, colder. Lena, Ethan and your father will betray you. Not because they're evil, but because they're afraid. Afraid of losing control, afraid of your strength. I've ensured you'll have what they tried to take, but you must decide how to use it. Revenge will tempt you, but legacy will last longer. Choose carefully. The words hit like a punch. For years, I'd thought my revenge was about justice, but now I wasn't sure if Grandma would have approved. Maybe she hadn't meant for me to expose them so publicly. Maybe she'd wanted me to lead by silence, not spectacle. Howard watched me fold the last letter. She loved you more than she ever said, he murmured. I know, I said softly. She just loved the game more. As I left his office, the afternoon rain had started fine silver threads falling across the city. Marcus handed me an umbrella, but I didn't open it. The rain felt clean. Honest. Back at the company, my assistant rushed to meet me. Ms. Vale, there's been movement on the market, she said breathless. Whitman Textiles is collapsing. Their shares dropped 60% overnight. And Ethan, he sold his remaining stock at a loss. I stopped in the middle of the hallway. How much of Whitman's stock is still floating? About 22%. I smiled. Buy it, all of it. Marcus's voice was low behind me. That's not revenge anymore. That's takeover. I looked at him. No, that's balance. By evening, I stood on the terrace outside my penthouse, the letters laid out before me. Grandma's words fluttered in the wind like silk banners. Her voice seemed to echo through the city. Power is quiet until it isn't. I whispered to the skyline. Then maybe it's time to make some noise. The phone buzzed again, Marcus this time. Transaction complete. You now own controlling interest in Whitman Textiles. I set the phone down beside the letters, the rain pooling around them like ink bleeding through fabric. My grandmother had built an empire through grace. I would protect it through precision. And this time the world wouldn't forget her name or mine. The invitation arrived 3 weeks later, gold embossed and perfumed, just like Ethan's wedding card had been. This one, however, came from Robert Whitman himself. An intimate dinner to discuss business opportunities. It read signed in heavy ink. I turned it over twice before laughing. The man had no idea I already owned the majority of his failing company. Marcus found me in the office that afternoon, flipping the envelope in my hand. You're going, he said, not even asking. Of course I am, I replied. Let's see how the mighty negotiate when they don't know they've already lost. The Whitman Club was as pretentious as I remembered. It wasn't just wealthy. It was aggressively old money, a fortress of mahogany and quiet deference where every glance felt like a credit check. The air wasn't sterile, but muted like someone had turned down the volume on ambition. The valet recognized me this time, though he didn't know why his voice trembled when he said my name. Inside, crystal chandeliers glowed like frozen fire. Waiters moved like ghosts between tables dressed in linen. I'd worn black again, simple, sharp, the color of control. It felt less like a dress and more like the shadow I was about to cast over the Whitman dynasty. I arrived 5 minutes early. I found a corner near an enormous, unblinking portrait of a long-dead Whitman patriarch, using the stillness to center myself. I wasn't just Lena Navarro, the humiliated sister. Tonight, I was the closing argument. Every detail, from the weight of the flatware to the vintage of the wine, was familiar, yet now felt provisional, awaiting my judgment. Robert Whitman stood near the bar, bourbon in hand, confidence in place. He looked smaller than he had at Ethan's wedding, though he still wore the same smile, the kind that came from decades of unchallenged power. But I noticed a tremor in his hand as he raised the glass, a tiny, almost invisible betrayal of his stress. Miss Vale, he said, warmly extending a hand. So glad you accepted. Mr. Whitman, I replied, shaking it lightly. I was curious. We took our seats in the private dining room. Ethan was already there, red-eyed and thinner, his arrogance now replaced with something that looked like fear. Sophie sat beside him, pale and perfectly still, picking nervously at the linen napkin. Her dress was expensive, yet it seemed to wear her rather than the other way around. Ethan saw me and offered a weak, brittle attempt at swagger. Lena, he said, voice brittle. You didn't tell me you'd be here. I like surprises, I said. Robert smiled as the waiter poured wine. No need for tension, family. This is business. We're all adults here. Some more than others, I murmured. He cleared his throat. Whitman Textiles is facing a liquidity issue. The press exaggerated, of course, but we're looking for a strategic investor to stabilize the company. I thought of you, Miss Vale. Your firm has made impressive moves in the luxury market. I sipped my wine. You mean the 22% of your stock my firm just purchased, Mr. Whitman? The final 22%. The room went silent. Sophie's fork clattered against her plate. Ethan stared at me like I'd just spoken another language. Robert's smile faltered for the first time. That was you technically, V. Monroe Holdings, but yes, we now own a controlling interest in Whitman Textiles. You didn't invite me here to negotiate a deal. You invited me to sign a transfer of power. This dinner is quite simply unnecessary. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're doing this to ruin me. No, I said. You did that when you forged Grandma's signature. I'm just collecting what belongs to our family. Robert exhaled slowly, his mask slipping. You think you can manage this company better than me? I don't think, I said softly. I know. He leaned back, eyes cold now. Be careful, Miss Vale. Power shifts, but it also isolates. You'll find yourself very alone at the top. Then it's a good thing I've always been comfortable alone. Sophie stood abruptly, clutching her clutch like a shield. This is madness, she said. You can't just waltz in here, and I looked at her, unblinking. You wore my design on your wedding day, Sophie. Don't lecture me about what I can or can't do. Her face was drained of color. I didn't know. You didn't ask, I interrupted. No one ever does. Robert pushed back his chair. If you intend to take my company, do it properly. Name your terms. Simple, I said. Step down as CEO. Ethan resigns from the board. I'll assume full operational control. You both keep your dignity and a minor stake, or you fight me and lose everything. He studied me for a long moment, then laughed once, a short bitter sound. You really are your grandmother's granddaughter. I take that as a compliment. The waiter entered, then awkward and uncertain, asking if we wanted dessert. No one answered. Ethan finally broke the silence. You've changed, Lena. I met his gaze evenly. No. I just stopped apologizing for existing. When I left, the night air was cool, the kind that carried the smell of rain and endings. Marcus was waiting by the car. How'd it go? Exactly as planned, I said, handing him the folded invitation. They're finished. He opened the door for me. And you? I looked out over the city lights, distant and bright. I'm just getting started. As we drove away, thunder rolled in the distance, low and deliberate. It sounded less like a warning and more like applause. The room smelled like power and fear. Reporters filled every inch of the conference hall, flashbulbs, microphones, murmurs. A backdrop of white and silver bore the name V. Monroe Holdings in bold letters, and beneath it the headline, Everyone had come for Whitman Textiles acquired. The air was thick with the kind of collective adrenaline that I used to watch from afar back when I was just a viewer, not the main event. Now every lens, every question was focused solely on me, the woman they had once called invisible. Marcus stood beside me, clipboard in hand, calm as stone. They'll go for blood, he said quietly. Be polite, but don't flinch. I never do, I replied, adjusting the cuff of my blazer. Black again. Minimalist, the same color Grandma wore to every victory meeting. The PR director gave the countdown. We live in 5-4. When the lights hit, I stepped forward. The noise dimmed like a wave pulling back to reveal its tide. Good morning, I began. I know many of you have questions. I'll answer the important one first. Yes, as of last night, V. Monroe Holdings has acquired a controlling interest in Whitman Textiles. The room erupted. Questions shot out like bullets. Ms. Vale, was this personal revenge? I waited calm until the noise fractured into silence again. Let me clarify something, I said evenly. This acquisition wasn't revenge. It was a restoration. The Whitman name once stood for craftsmanship and legacy. My grandmother, Vivian Monroe, designed them before they erased her signature from her own work. Today, that legacy returns to where it belongs. A hand shot up in the front row. Ms. Vale, are you confirming that your grandmother's designs were stolen? Yes, I said simply, and I have the records to prove it. Marcus stepped forward and placed a leather-bound ledger on the podium. The camera zoomed in page after page of sketches signed by V. Monroe, all predating the so-called Whitman originals by decades. The gasps were audible. The next question came from a young reporter in the second row. What happened to Ethan Navarro? I met her eyes. He's family. The family doesn't get fired. They get forgotten. The crowd stirred. I could feel the room shift, the collective recognition that this wasn't just business, it was history correcting itself. Grandma would have liked this. She'd have laughed, maybe even applauded. Marcus leaned in, whispering, "You just added $2 billion to our valuation." I smiled faintly. Then it's been a productive morning. A final hand went up. Ms. Vale, do you consider yourself a billionaire now? I paused, considering. The word used to sound foreign, distant, something that belonged to men like Whitman and my father. I consider myself, I said, a builder. Money's just the scaffolding. The applause was hesitant at first, then stronger. The cameras flashed again, capturing the moment. Afterward, in the private lounge, I slipped off my heels and poured a glass of water. My reflection in the window stared back, composed, unrecognizable. You realize what you just did, right? Marcus said. You didn't just buy a company. You changed the industry narrative. Good, I said. It needed changing. He hesitated, watching me. And Ethan, he'll try to come back, I said. They always do when the dust settles. But by then, he'll find the doors locked. The city stretched out below, endless glass and steel. From up here, everything looked smaller, even pain. The door opened behind me. My mother stepped in, elegant as always, though her eyes were tired. I hadn't invited her. She must have charmed security like she always did. Lena, she said softly, that was quite a show. It wasn't a show. It was true. She sighed. You're more like her than you realize. I know, I said, turning toward the window again. That's what scares you. She didn't deny it. Ethan's in trouble. The press is hounding him. He's drinking. He needs help. Then he should call a therapist, I said. Not me. Her voice trembled slightly. He's your brother. He was, I said quietly, before he chose to become my enemy. She looked at me for a long time as if searching for the daughter she'd lost somewhere between poverty and power. Finally, she said, your grandmother would be proud, but she'd also tell you revenge doesn't keep you warm at night. I turned to face her fully. Neither does betrayal. When she left, the silence returned heavy but strangely comforting. Marcus came back a few minutes later. The press wants a follow-up statement for tomorrow. Send them a quote, I said. Tell them the era of stolen credit is over. He grinned. That's going to trend. Good, I said, slipping my heels back on. It should. Outside, the city buzzed, unaware that it was standing on the edge of a new order, one built by the woman everyone once called plain. And for the first time, the world finally saw her clearly. Thanksgiving arrived like a storm I'd seen coming but couldn't quite avoid. My mother insisted on hosting at the old family home in Westport, a sprawling white colonial with a porch swing that hadn't moved since Grandma's funeral. I hadn't been back since the reading, and I could already feel the ghosts waiting at the doorway. Don't cause a scene, Marcus warned as he helped me load the dessert boxes into the car. I don't start scenes, I said, buckling my seatbelt. I finish them. The drive was long, gray, and strangely quiet. The trees had lost their color. Even the sky seemed undecided. By the time I pulled up the gravel driveway, I could already hear laughter from inside. Ethan's voice, louder than it should have been, carried through the open window. When I walked in, the conversation stopped mid-sentence. My mother stood by the oven, wearing pearls and tension. My father looked up from carving the turkey, his knife hovering above the cutting board. Ethan was at the head of the table, drink in hand, already half drunk on charm and scotch. Well, he said with a crooked smile, look who decided to show up. Miss CEO herself. What, no entourage tonight, just me, I said. Didn't think your dining room could fit my empire. Sophie looked down at her plate, her face pale. She hadn't spoken to me since the Whitman takeover. I didn't expect her to start now. My mother cleared her throat. Let's all try to be civil, please. It's Thanksgiving. Of course, I said, setting the pies on the counter. Nothing says gratitude like family pretending not to hate each other. My father gave me that look, the same one he used when I was 12, and refused to apologize after Ethan broke my favorite sketchbook. Lena, he said sharply. That's enough. No, I replied. Enough was years ago when you let him take everything and called it fairness. The room went still. Only the sound of the clock filled the silence. Ethan laughed, but it cracked halfway through. Oh, come on, Lena. You got your revenge. You humiliated me, destroyed my reputation, and took my company. You win. What else do you want? I met his eyes. Accountability. I'll take that as a compliment, I said. My mother's voice trembled. She built this family's name, Ethan. Don't you dare speak about her that way. Ethan slammed his glass down. She built her name. We were just her shadows. That's when I saw it, the same fear Grandma had written about in her last letter. The fear of being small in the light of someone else's greatness. Ethan wasn't cruel because he wanted to be. He was cruel because he was terrified. Dinner passed in awkward silence. My mother tried to fill it with stories from the past, but no one really listened. The food tasted fine, but it felt like ash in my mouth. Halfway through dessert, Sophie excused herself, muttering something about a headache. Ethan followed a few minutes later. I could hear their voices through the hallway door, muffled, urgent. I didn't mean to listen, but one word caught my attention, shares. I stood quietly by the kitchen doorway. She hasn't won yet, Ethan whispered fiercely. She may have Whitman, but Dad still controls the original Navarro estate shares. If we can get him to transfer those remaining stocks to me before she files the trust papers, she loses the majority and the executor power over Grandma's wealth. Are you sure? Sophie's voice trembled. I've already talked to the lawyer. We do it quietly and she won't see it coming. I stepped forward. You really should have learned by now. I always see it coming. Ethan froze. Sophie's face drained of blood. My father walked in at that exact moment, the room colliding with tension so sharp it could cut glass. What's going on? He demanded. I turned to him. You're giving him the estate shares, aren't you? He hesitated, which was all the answer I needed. I just thought, he began, but his voice faltered. You thought wrong, I said coldly. Grandma left them in trust for the company's stability, not for another Navarro ego trip. Ethan stood up. Fists clenched. You don't control this family. I stepped closer, my voice calm, deadly. No, I control the empire it lives on. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother started to cry softly into her napkin. My father turned away, ashamed. Ethan glared at me like he wanted to say something, but no words came. Finally, I picked up my coat. Enjoy the rest of your dinner. I have a business to run. As I walked out, the wind was sharp, cold enough to sting. The lights of the house glowed behind me, warm, familiar, and full of everything I'd outgrown. Marcus called as I reached the car. How bad was it? Worse than expected, I said, starting the engine. But I think it's time we move forward with the next step. He hesitated. The inheritance clause? Yes, I said, watching the house disappear in the rearview mirror. If they want war, I'll give them a masterclass in how it's won. The morning after Thanksgiving, the city felt sharper, as if even the air had chosen a side. I sat in my office before sunrise, the letters from Grandma spread across my desk again. Each one felt heavier now, like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. Marcus arrived carrying 2 coffees and a folder marked Legal Urgent. He didn't sit. It's time, he said simply. I nodded. The inheritance clause. He placed the papers in front of me. Vivian Monroe's will included a conditional trust. You're the executor, but the trigger clause requires proof that any direct heir who acts in bad faith against the company forfeits their share automatically. Ethan and your father signed acknowledgement documents when the trust was created. I scanned the lines, already knowing what they meant. So if Ethan tried to move assets, He's already voided his claim. Marcus smiled faintly. Exactly. For a moment, I just sat there, the reality of it sinking in. 4 years of restraint of acting small now culminated in one signature. This wasn't just about reclaiming assets, it was about defining the future. It wasn't enough to simply win. The victory had to be cleaner, stronger, and more beneficial than anything Ethan ever pursued. Prepare the press release, I said. By the time he wakes up, I want every outlet to know Whitman Textiles and Monroe Holdings are merging under a single entity. His name won't appear anywhere. Marcus hesitated. Lena, this isn't just business anymore. You'll destroy him publicly. He destroyed himself, I said. I'm just turning on the lights. By noon, the office buzzed with the hum of controlled chaos. PR, legal, finance, all working like a single pulse. Outside my window, snow had started to fall, slow and deliberate, the first sign of winter. Then my phone rang. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering. You think you're clever? He said, voice slurred and bitter. You think you can erase me? I don't need to, I said calmly. You did that yourself. You're not invincible, Lena. You're just playing with money Grandma built. You don't know what it's like to earn it. I smiled slightly. You're right. I was too busy building an empire you never saw coming. He laughed, a harsh, broken sound. This isn't over. It is, I said and hung up. Marcus entered a moment later with a printout. We got something from the family attorney. Your father transferred his estate shares to Ethan 2 days ago, retroactively dated. So they forged again, I murmured. He nodded grimly. But it doesn't matter. The clause overrides it. Fraud voids the transfer. I stood and walked to the window. Below the city looked like a snow globe. Tiny cars, blurred lights, people rushing through the cold. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably pacing his apartment, realizing his power was gone. File it, I said quietly. Enforce the clause. The next 48 hours unfolded like a chess game I'd already memorized. The board shifted, the players moved, and one by one they fell. The official statement went live. Monday morning, effective immediately, the Monroe Trust invokes the inheritance clause transferring full ownership of all Monroe and Whitman assets to Ms. Lena Vale. By noon, every business journal in America had published it. The stock market reacted within hours, shares doubled. Investors called it a return to form. Ethan called again that night, but this time I didn't answer. Instead, my mother's number appeared moments later. I almost didn't pick up. Lena, she said, her voice shaking. Your brother's gone. I froze. What do you mean, gone? He left. No note, no call. His apartment's empty. For a moment, the world tilted. All the anger, the cold precision, it cracked just slightly. Did you check with Sophie? She's the one who found the place like that? Then let him go, I said finally. He's made his choice. But that night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat by the window staring at the falling snow. Revenge had always looked cleaner in my imagination, sharp, justified, almost beautiful. In reality, it was messy, human, and unbearably quiet afterward. Marcus texted near midnight, clause executed. Media response positive. Congratulations, CEO. I set the phone down. Somewhere deep inside, I could almost hear Grandma's voice, steady, amused, proud. Being underestimated, she'd said once, is the sharpest weapon a woman can carry. But victory means knowing when to stop cutting. I exhaled slowly. The war was over. The empire was mine. And yet the silence that followed victory sounded a lot like loneliness. The studio lights were merciless, white-hot, and unblinking. I sat in the center of them, a thin microphone clipped to my collar cameras aimed from every angle. Across from me, the host of Good Morning America smiled, like he'd been waiting all week for this interview. Behind the cameras, Marcus stood in the shadows, nodding once as the countdown began. 3, 2, 1, live. Welcome back, the host began cheerfully. We're here today with Lena Vale, the youngest female CEO to lead a billion-dollar merger in the fashion industry. Lena, thank you for joining us on Christmas morning. Thank you for having me, I said smoothly, hands resting on my lap. I wore one of my own designs, a sleek white dress with subtle metallic threading, quiet luxury. Power disguised as grace. He leaned forward. You've become quite the household name, especially after the Whitman acquisition. But the world also knows about your family drama. The will, the inheritance clause, the public fallout, people are calling it the most shocking family story since Succession. How do you respond? I smiled just enough to look human. Families are complicated. Ours just happened to play out under spotlights instead of behind closed doors. The audience laughed lightly, but the host pressed on. There are rumors your brother tried to take control of your company before disappearing. Do you know where he is? The studio went quiet. I didn't blink. No, I said, and I hope he finds peace wherever that is. He hesitated. Do you regret how far things went? That question hung heavy in the air. I looked at the camera, knowing millions of viewers were watching, judging. Regret, I said softly. I regret believing that family and fairness were the same thing. They're not. The producer motioned off camera. 3 minutes left. The host nodded. And yet, despite everything, your stories inspired thousands of women. You've built a global brand you own, controlling shares in 5 companies, and you've pledged a major portion of your profits to women-owned startups. Why? Because power means nothing if you're the only one who has it, I said. My grandmother built an empire and spent her whole life underestimated. I'm not here to be admired. I'm here to make sure no woman ever gets erased again. Applause broke through the silence. Even the host clapped once before continuing. One final question. What's next for Lena Vale? I smiled. Restoration. Not revenge, not legacy, restoration. The red light above the camera blinked off. We were clear. The host stood, shook my hand and whispered, "That line will go viral." I turned to Marcus as he approached. Was that too much? It was perfect, he said. You looked unshakable. The silence after the victory felt heavier than I'd expected. I admitted, allowing myself a moment of real honesty. We walked out into the New York cold. Snow fell in slow, delicate flakes, the kind that coated everything in temporary forgiveness. Marcus handed me a paper cup of coffee as we crossed the plaza. You know, he said quietly, your grandmother used to do interviews like that, too calm, dangerous, and absolutely in control. I laughed softly. She'd probably hate that I'm on TV, but she'd be proud of what you said, he corrected softly. That's all that matters. When I reached the car, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something instinct maybe made me answer. Lena. It was Sophie. Her voice was small, broken. Sophie. My tone was cautious. Are you all right? I thought you should know. Ethan's in California. He checked into rehab last week. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Is he's alive? She said quickly. He asked me to tell you he's sorry. I leaned against the car, the city noise fading into a blur. Thank you, I whispered. She hesitated. He said he watched your interview yesterday, the preview clip. He said you looked like Grandma. The line went quiet. I swallowed hard. Tell him I meant what I said on air. I hope he finds peace. After the call, I stood there in the cold, the snow melting into my hair. For the first time in months, my chest didn't feel heavy. Marcus watched me silently from a few steps away. You okay? He asked. I think so, I said, a deep sense of relief settling in my chest. I think the fighting is finally over. We drove through the city as the Christmas lights glowed in every window. Children laughed on sidewalks. Couples carried gifts. And for the first time, I felt part of something bigger than survival. At a red light, Marcus glanced at me. You know the press will call this your redemption arc. Let them, I said quietly. It's not redemption. It's clear. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, endless cleansing. And somewhere on the other side of the country, my brother was finally trying to rebuild what he'd broken, while I at last was learning how to stop fighting ghosts and start living again. Spring came early that year, bright and restless. The world had started calling me the woman who rebuilt Monroe. But inside, I still felt like the girl sitting quietly at Ethan's wedding, ignored, underestimated, invisible. Except now invisibility had become my weapon, my armor, and my brand. The annual shareholders meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Every seat in the conference hall at the Monroe Tower was filled with reporters, investors, former rivals, all waiting for the next big announcement. Marcus stood near the stage, calm as ever, running through the agenda. "We've had the best quarter in company history. Our stock's up 64%. You just have to say the words. The words I asked." He smiled. "The ones that remind everyone why they bet on you." When I walked on stage, the applause was immediate, thunderous. It should have felt triumphant, but there was something else, something quieter beneath it. Expectation. They weren't cheering for who I was. They were cheering for what I could do for them. "Good afternoon," I began. When my grandmother built Monroe Holdings, she believed in patience. In her words, "The best revenge isn't success, it's permanence." Today we proved her right. A ripple of interest moved through the crowd. Behind me, the massive screen lit up, revealing the new merger logo, Monroe Global. The name shimmered in silver and gold, elegant and sharp. "As of this morning," I continued, "we have acquired controlling shares in Devereaux Industries and Harper Textiles. Both are being restructured under Monroe Global. Our goal isn't domination, it's innovation. We'll redefine sustainable fashion, and we'll do it on our terms." The room buzzed with excitement. The stock ticker at the bottom of the screen jumped again, numbers flashing like a heartbeat. Then a voice cut through the crowd. "And what about the Navarro family's shares?" It was a man in a navy suit, a hedge fund representative, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "Rumor has it your brother still holds a small portion through the estate." I didn't flinch. "That's correct," I said. "Ethan Navarro retains less than 1% of Monroe Global stock, and per his request, those shares will be converted into a charitable trust for addiction recovery programs nationwide." The audience went silent for a moment, then broke into applause, genuine this time. I saw Marcus's expression soften at the edge of the stage. He hadn't known I planned to announce that. When the meeting ended, the investors swarmed me, handshakes, congratulations, promises of partnership. It was the kind of adoration that once would have thrilled me. Now it just felt heavy. Marcus found me in the hallway afterward, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "That was genius," he said. "The trust, the tone, the control you gave them, the story they wanted, and the redemption they didn't expect." "I didn't do it for them," I said, taking the glass. "I did it for him." He studied me quietly. "You've changed." "I've grown," I corrected. "Grandma built an empire from silence. I built mine from noise. But maybe it's time for balance." That evening I sat in my office overlooking the city, the skyline bleeding gold and pink as the sun dipped. On the desk sat a single envelope forwarded from the rehab facility in California. The handwriting was unmistakable, Ethan's. I hesitated before opening it. "Lena, I watched the shareholders' meeting. I saw what you did with the trust. I don't deserve your mercy, but I'm grateful for it. You were right. I was afraid of you, of Grandma, of never being enough. I thought taking control would make me powerful, but power without respect is nothing. I'm getting better. I'm learning what real work looks like. Maybe one day I'll build something of my own, not from inheritance, from effort. Tell Mom I'm sorry. Tell yourself the same thing if you ever need to. E." I sat there for a long time reading those lines over and over until they blurred. I'd imagined this apology for years, but not like this. The words didn't heal. It was the silence between them that finally did. The letter wasn't an apology I could cash, but it was real, and that was enough. Marcus knocked once before entering. "The board wants you at the after-party. Press champagne, all that." I smiled faintly. "Let them celebrate. I have work to do." As he left, I turned back to the window. The city glittered below, restless and alive. Somewhere in that maze of lights, my brother was rebuilding his life, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to compete. I'd won everything I'd set out to claim, shares, stock, legacy. But what mattered most wasn't what I owned. It was what I'd reclaimed, my peace. The city lights blurred outside the window, and this time I didn't feel like a weapon anymore. Just a woman who finally got to rest. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. A year had passed since the night of my brother's disastrous wedding, a night that marked both his ruin and my public ascension. Now I was standing under the same vaulted ceilings of St. Augustine Hall, but this time not as a guest. The hall had been transformed for a charity gala hosted by Monroe Global. Cameras lined the entrance, soft jazz played from the balcony, and the world had come to watch the woman who rebuilt an empire walk through her past like it was a runway. I stepped out of the car in a black gown, the same shade Grandma had once called quiet armor. The fabric shimmered with subtle threads of silver, catching every flash of light as photographers called my name. Inside, Marcus greeted me with his usual calm. Ready to close the circle, I smiled. It was never a circle, Marcus. It was a climb. The guests turned as I entered, the same people who had once laughed at me for being plain, for being practical, for being the broke sister. Now they whispered a different word. Billionaire. At the far end of the room, I saw Sophie. She looked older, softer. Ethan wasn't with her. He was still in California working with the foundation we'd built from his trust shares. She approached hesitantly. You look beautiful, she said quietly. So do you, I replied. How's he doing? Better. He's teaching art therapy to the patients. Said he wanted to build something that didn't involve money for once. I smiled. That sounds like the real Ethan. For a moment we just stood there, two women who'd both been wounded by the same man and somehow healed in parallel. She touched my arm lightly. I think your grandmother would be proud. I hope so, I said. She always believed in long games. A waiter passed with champagne, and I took a glass, turning toward the stage. Marcus gave the signal it was time for my speech. The lights dimmed as I walked up the steps, the room falling silent. Thank you all for being here. I began, my voice steady through the microphone. A year ago, I sat in this same hall and listened to someone tell a room full of people that I was cheap, that I'd never be enough. And I believed him just for a while. But here's what I've learned since: being underestimated is not an insult. It's an advantage. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. I continued. Power doesn't come from money. It comes from patience, from knowing when to stay quiet, when to strike, and when to forgive. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the room, the executives, the investors, the journalists. Tonight's gala isn't about success. It's about restoration. Every dollar raised tonight goes to the Monroe Foundation to help women who were told they were too plain, too old, too small to matter. We're done apologizing for being underestimated. The applause rose steady and warm. For the first time, it didn't sound like noise. It sounded like recognition. After the speeches and photographs, I found myself alone on the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glittered beneath me, alive and endless. Marcus joined me quietly, handing over a small glass of wine. You know, he said, it's strange. The woman who built this empire looks exactly like the one who sat at that wedding table pretending she didn't care. I laughed softly. That woman cared too much about what others saw. This one finally learned to see herself. He tilted his glass toward me. To Vivian Monroe. I raised mine. The lessons learned the hard way. We clinked glasses, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The city hummed below, cars, laughter, life moving on. Later that night, back in my penthouse, I passed by the full-length mirror in my hallway, the one Grandma had given me before she died. Its frame was carved with her favorite quote, the one she used to whisper when the world dismissed her, "They never see us coming." I stopped staring at my reflection. The black gown, the calm eyes, the woman who had once been mocked for being ordinary. Now she was everything she'd ever needed to be. Not flawless, not vengeful, just free. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and deliberate, as if the city itself was exhaling. I opened the balcony doors and let the cold air rush in. It smelled like new beginnings, and for the first time since that night at my brother's wedding, I didn't feel the need to prove anything to him, to them, to anyone. The revenge had already done its work. Now all that was left was peace. Grandma, I whispered to the wind, you were right. They never saw me coming. But I think they'll remember me now. and somewhere I could almost hear her laughter, low, proud, and utterly satisfied.
"Get out. You're not welcome in this house anymore." My mother-in-law Helen's voice echoed through the mansion's marble foyer. Her face was twisted with rage as she threw my belongings onto the perfectly manicured lawn. Behind her, my husband David stood with his arm wrapped around a woman I'd never seen before, both of them wearing matching smirks. My name is Anna, and at 32, I was watching my decade-long marriage crumble on my in-laws' front lawn. But unlike what they expected, I wasn't crying or begging. Instead, I felt an odd sense of calm as I watched Helen's performance. "You ungrateful witch." Helen continued her tirade. "How dare you accuse my David of trying to steal your money? He deserves that inheritance more than you ever did." I almost laughed at the irony. Just hours earlier, I discovered their elaborate plan to transfer my inheritance, the money my grandmother had left me, into an account they controlled. The account was conveniently registered under the name of Jessica, the woman now clutching my husband's arm. "Mom, don't waste your breath," David said, his voice dripping with contempt. "She's always been paranoid about her precious inheritance. That's why we had to be creative." Creative. That's what he called secretly meeting with lawyers to forge my signature. Creative was how he described planning to marry his mistress without divorcing me first, just to keep me from claiming my share of our marital assets. I calmly picked up my bag from the grass. "You're right, Helen. I should leave." My composed response clearly threw them off balance. They had expected tears, drama, perhaps even a scene they could use against me later. "That's it." Jessica spoke up for the first time, her young face confused. "You're just going to leave." I smiled, remembering the USB drive safely tucked in my pocket. Yes, that's exactly what I'm going to do. 3 hours earlier, I had arrived at the mansion for our weekly family dinner. Everything seemed normal. Helen fussing over David as usual, my father-in-law George buried in his newspaper. But when I went to use Helen's computer to print some documents for work, I found something interesting. Emails between her, David, and their lawyer discussing how to transfer Anna's assets without her knowledge. The plan was elaborate. They had been gathering my personal information for months, practicing my signature, even had a notary on their payroll. The final step was to have me sign what I thought would be renovation papers for our house, but would actually be documents transferring my inheritance to Jessica. What they didn't know was that I'd suspected something was wrong for weeks. David's sudden interest in my grandmother's inheritance, his mysterious phone calls, Helen's unusual questions about my bank accounts, it all added up to something suspicious. So I'd taken precautions. Hidden cameras in our house caught David's late-night meetings with Jessica and his mother, where they planned everything in detail. My phone recorded every conversation where Helen casually asked about my financial arrangements, and most importantly, I'd already moved my inheritance into a trust that only I could access. "You think you're so clever," Helen spat as I walked toward my car. "But you're nothing without this family. Nothing." I turned back one last time. "We'll see about that, Helen. Give me 3 months. Just 3 months." David laughed. 3 months for what? To beg for forgiveness?" "No," I replied, starting my car. 3 months for you to realize exactly what you've lost." As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror. Helen gesturing wildly, David holding Jessica, all of them probably congratulating themselves on getting rid of me so easily. They had no idea what was coming. I drove straight to my best friend Olivia's house. She opened the door before I could even knock, worry etched on her face. "Did you get what you needed?" I pulled out the USB drive. Everything. Every email, every forged document, every conversation about their little plan. I collapsed onto her couch, finally letting the events of the day sink in. They didn't even try to deny it, Liv. They were proud of their scheme. Olivia sat beside me, her lawyer instincts already kicking in. "Then they've handed us everything we need. The recordings, the emails, the witnesses, it's all admissible in court." I nodded, thinking about the next steps. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, securing my assets, gathering evidence, building a case that would be impossible to defend against. But watching David stand there with his mistress, seeing Helen's true colors on full display, it still hurt more than I expected. "You know what the funny part is?" I said, accepting the glass of wine Olivia offered. "They think they've won. They actually believe I walked away because I'm weak." Olivia smiled, a fierce protective glint in her eye. Then they clearly never knew the real you. So what's the plan? I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I needed. First, we call Robert Harrison, the federal investigator who's been waiting for evidence of Helen's financial fraud. Then, we let the dominoes fall exactly where I've lined them up. And David, Jessica? I smiled, thinking about the paper trail I discovered linking them to Helen's broader scheme. They chose their side. Now they get to go down with the ship. As night fell, I sat in Olivia's guest room, looking through old photos on my phone. 10 years of marriage reduced to evidence in a fraud case. But as I closed the photo album and opened my email to contact Investigator Harrison, I felt stronger than I had in years. They thought they were destroying me. Instead, they had freed me to take them all down. Let them enjoy their victory for now. In 3 months, I'd learn exactly who they were dealing with. The first signs that something was wrong appeared exactly 2 weeks after I left. I was having coffee with Olivia when my phone buzzed with a text from my father-in-law, George. "Anna, we need to talk. Something's not right with the company accounts." I showed the message to Olivia, who raised an eyebrow. Right on schedule. What George had discovered was just the tip of the iceberg. For years, Helen had been using the family's real estate company to run a sophisticated fraud scheme. My evidence didn't just prove their plan to steal my inheritance, it revealed a pattern of financial manipulation that went back decades. I texted back a simple response. Ask Helen of the Riverside Properties deal. Within minutes, my phone was flooded with calls. First from George, then Helen, and finally David. I ignored them all, knowing exactly what they found. The Riverside Properties transaction was Helen's biggest mistake, and the documentation I'd gathered proved she'd embezzled nearly $2 million through fake renovation contracts. "Your mother-in-law's been busy," Investigator Harrison said during our meeting that afternoon. He spread the documents across his desk, each page revealing another layer of fraud. "And your husband was actively helping her cover it up." I nodded, watching as he added my evidence to his growing file. They got careless. When they started planning to steal my inheritance, they left their other records vulnerable. "Mrs. Collins," Harrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "This is going to get ugly. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Helen's screaming face, David's smirk, Jessica's confused expression. They made it ugly when they planned to steal everything I had. The next day, federal agents arrived at Helen's office. I wasn't there to see it, but Olivia's colleague who worked in the same building described how Helen was escorted out, still shouting that it was all a misunderstanding. David called me that evening, his voice no longer smug. "What did you do?" he demanded. "Mom's been arrested." "I didn't do anything, David. The federal investigation into Helen's fraud has been ongoing for months. I just stopped helping hide it." "You're lying. You set this up." I could hear Jessica in the background, asking what was happening. "No, David. Your mother set this up when she decided to steal from her own company. You set this up when you helped her hide it. I just stopped being complicit." The silence on his end was deafening. "Oh, and David," I added, "you might want to check those documents you signed last month. The ones about the renovation project. They've been submitted to the investigation." He hung up without another word. Over the next few weeks, the truth about Helen's schemes unraveled spectacularly. The local papers ran stories about the prominent real estate family's fall from grace. Former employees came forward with their own evidence of fraud. Even George, once he realized the extent of his wife's deception, began cooperating with investigators. Jessica disappeared first, leaving David with nothing but a text message. "This isn't what I signed up for." Apparently, the promise of my inheritance wasn't worth facing federal fraud charges. I watched it all unfold from a safe distance, focusing on rebuilding my life. Olivia helped me find a new apartment, and I threw myself into my work, letting the investigators handle the rest. Then came the call I'd been waiting for. "Mrs. Collins?" Investigator Harrison's voice was triumphant. "We've frozen all their accounts. The evidence you provided led us to 6 other fraud schemes. They're looking at serious prison time." I sat down, feeling the weight of the past month lift from my shoulders. "And David?" "Your husband's been charged as an accomplice. We found his fingerprints all over the fake documents. He's looking at 5 to 10 years. That evening, as I sat on my new balcony watching the sunset, my phone lit up with a message from Helen. Even under house arrest, she couldn't help trying to have the last word. "You've destroyed this family," she wrote. "I hope you're happy." I thought about responding, about pointing out that she had destroyed her own family with her greed and manipulation. Instead, I simply blocked her number. 2 months had passed since that day on the lawn. 2 months of watching karma deliver exactly what they deserved. But sitting there, looking at the city lights, I realized I didn't feel victorious. I felt peaceful. They had tried to take everything from me, but in doing so, they had given me something invaluable. Freedom from their toxicity and the strength to stand up for myself. As I reached for my wine glass, my phone buzzed one last time. It was George. "Anna," his message read, "I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner." I looked at those words for a long time, thinking about how different things might have been if he'd stopped Helen years ago. But the past was the past. The future, however, was looking surprisingly bright. 1 month left in my promised 3 months, and already their perfect little world had crumbled. But the final piece of my plan was still to come, and for that, I needed to make just one more phone call. "Hello," I said when the line connected. "This is Anna Collins. I'd like to schedule a meeting about purchasing Riverside properties." The irony wasn't lost on me. The same property that had exposed Helen's fraud would now become the foundation of my new beginning. Let them think they'd won that day on the lawn. Their victory had lasted exactly 2 weeks. My victory? That would last a lifetime. The 3-month mark arrived on a crisp autumn morning. I stood outside the courthouse, adjusting my blazer as reporters gathered on the steps. Today was Helen's sentencing hearing, and the media was eager to cover the downfall of one of the city's most prominent families. "Ready for this?" Olivia asked, standing beside me with her briefcase. I nodded, watching David and his father arrive separately. David looked nothing like the smug man who'd stood with his mistress 3 months ago. His designer suits had been replaced by an ill-fitting department store number, his confident strut now a defeated shuffle. The hearing proceeded exactly as expected. Helen, despite her tearful pleas for leniency, was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. The judge was particularly harsh given her attempts to frame others for her crimes, including a last-ditch effort to claim I had orchestrated everything. "Mrs. Harrison Collins," the judge addressed me directly after announcing the sentence. "The court acknowledges your cooperation in exposing this fraud. Your inheritance will remain protected under the trust you established." I caught Helen's venomous glare from the defendant's table. This wasn't how she'd imagined things playing out when she'd thrown my belongings onto her lawn. David was sentenced next, 5 years for his role in the fraud scheme. As they led him away, he looked back at me one last time. "I never thought you'd fight back," he said quietly. "That was your first mistake," I replied. Outside the courthouse, George approached me. He'd aged years in just 3 months, the stress of everything etching deep lines in his face. "Anna, I know it doesn't mean much now, but I truly am sorry." I studied the man who'd stood silently by while his wife and son plotted to steal everything from me. "You're right, George. It doesn't mean much now, but maybe someday it will." Later that afternoon, I had one final meeting, the closing on Riverside properties. The irony wasn't lost on anyone when I submitted the winning bid for the property that had exposed Helen's fraud. I planned to transform it into affordable housing for domestic abuse survivors, a project that would erase Helen's toxic legacy and create something meaningful in its place. "Quite a 3 months," Olivia remarked as we celebrated that evening. "You said they'd regret it, but I don't think even you expected all this." I swirled my wine, thinking about everything that had transpired. They thought they were punishing me that day, throwing me out like I was nothing. But they gave me exactly what I needed, the push to stop protecting them from themselves. The local paper ran one final story about the case the next day. The headline read, "Family Fraud Scheme Exposed. Justice Prevails." Below it was a quote from investigator Harrison. "Sometimes the people we think are victims turn out to be the strongest among us." I kept a copy of that paper, not as a reminder of their betrayal, but of my own strength. 3 months had changed everything, but the biggest change was in me. I was no longer the woman they thought they could discard. I was someone stronger, someone who fought back. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Jessica. I should have known better. "I'm sorry." I deleted the message without responding. Her apology, like Helen's schemes and David's betrayal, belonged in the past. My future was ahead of me, and for the first time in years, I was actually excited to see what it held. Standing on the balcony of my new apartment that evening, I raised a glass to myself. Here's to 3 months, I whispered to the city lights, and to all the years ahead. They had tried to write my ending that day on the lawn. Instead, they had only written their own. My story? It was just beginning. The final papers arrived a week later. My divorce was official, Helen's assets were forfeit, and Riverside Properties was mine. As I signed the last document, I remembered Helen's words, "You're nothing without this family." She was right about one thing. I was nothing like their family, and that had turned out to be my greatest strength.